It's fairly easy to start a war, but difficult to finish one. The upcoming days see the end of the Second World War and the Vietnamese War. And it poses the question, do wars actually end? We'll discuss how wars actually end, and does this mean a just peace after a just war? Join me, Jan Darasz, for How We Got Here.
With the end of the Second World War in Europe, no one had dared call this conflict the war to end all wars, as they had the First World War. It would have seemed that humankind had grown out of such lofty terms. But as Germany and later Japan sat at the table to sign the capitulation, there were many who could not help but wonder whether this was truly the end. After all, the Soviet Union and the rest of the Allies were not partners because they liked each other or had similar views of the world. In a different world, many believe, they would have been enemies. And this view would be proven true, as while the dust settled over the ruins of Europe and the Second World War came to an end, war itself did not. Soon enough, the Western Allies and the USSR were eyeing each other with distrust, and a new era of warfare dawned upon the world. This time, it was an era of Cold War. Some believe that the Cold War, and by extension almost the entire second half of the 20th century, is nothing but one long conflict with different faces. Like the Korean War, which came barely 5 years after Germany's capitulation. It was not a global war, but it did come from the fallout of the Second World War and the Japanese invasion of China. And even today, it has not been resolved. South and North Korea are still technically in a state of war, with a demilitarized zone separating them. Yet in today's age of globalization and connection, ripples of water near the Pacific reverberate beyond the immediate region.
The Indo-Pacific is now suddenly connected to the European theater in a way that nobody thought for possible.
Individual wars of the past did end, at least formally. No one could say that the Napoleonic Wars or the First World War are still ongoing. But when they end, they send those ripples across history. And 80 years after the end of the Second World War, those ripples seem to be surging into waves.
I'm delighted to be joined today by our regular guest, Bartłomiej Kot, the Programme Director at the Warsaw Security Forum. Welcome once more to the programme.
Wonderful to be here.
Is the way we speak about, or way we think about the ending of a war, is that our problem? Is that the historians' problem? They like to compartmentalise wars chronologically. The end of the Second World War leads to the Cold War. Is that something that can be done, or is it just the human condition just one long continuation of war and punctuated by a few months of non-war? Is that a cynical way of?
Well, cynical in some way you may say so, but this is like rather a philosophical question in my opinion. How do you conduct the diplomacy? How you conduct the foreign policy? How you conduct also warfare? What we can see right now, because this is like we're talking in a very concrete stage of course of war in Ukraine that gives us a context to where we stand. The thing is that we come back to realism in politics, and what it brings back is also our perception of warfare for certain. We're back in von Clausewitz's way of thinking that actually warfare is only like a continuation of diplomacy by other means. This is also pretty much very in the context of also what Frederick the Great said, that you can conduct diplomacy only if you have also the military means. But this is like a music without instruments, that would be. The thing is that this way of thinking, this chain of thinking, it hasn't changed in my opinion since the very beginnings of our dealings with history, with foreign policy as such. What has changed is also it is only the fact that throughout the last 60 years or so, or even less, since 1989, we put ourselves in a way of thinking about word as if history had actually ended, and it had not. The countries such as Russian Federation or the USSR prior to that, they were still thinking in these realistic terms, despite the fact that the West had a different perception of time, of politics. And what we can see right now with the war in Ukraine, it is that even the Western nations have once again came back to the position of thinking about warfare, about politics in this very realistic terms. We may like it or not. Many people criticize Donald Trump because of that, but the truth is out there. I mean, even the European Union started to think about itself in a very geopolitical way, and it actually, in a way, discovered the fact that in order to become a geopolitical power, you have to have also military means.
It reminds me of a line from Sam Peckinpah's Cross of Iron. Two German officers are discussing the philosophical aspects of war, and James Mason, one asks the other, what are you going to do after the war's finished? And David Warner replies, get ready for the next one. It's a way of thinking about the human condition that encompasses war, diplomacy, economics. History hasn't ended, I suppose. That it seemed to do in the 1990s with Francis Fukuyama's, or an interpretation of Francis Fukuyama's.
I suspect it goes even deeper than that. In some years from the time where we sit right now, I suspect a lot of people would also find these traits in cultural aspects of our times. How much even the perception in art and in filmography, that it is a trait that is existent, that people are changing their perception about reality, thinking about war as something which is not very distant but very close to where they sit and what they do. Take the discussions that possibly a lot of our families had during the Easter time. A lot of these discussions in the family gatherings were probably also questions related to what extent this war also impacts us. 20 years ago, I wouldn't imagine this kind of discussion happening. It is happening right now, and I suspect it also shapes a lot of our perception about politics, about foreign policy. And once you open this toolbox, open that for also politicians, I'm certain that they will, find a way to use these tools.
When we think about, or when we theorize about how wars start, we have Clausewitz and Thucydides and Sun Tzu, all these thinkers about war. Is it possible to theorize about how wars end? Do they end because exhaustion, because of attainment of war aims, or is it do they just seem to end like a street fight ends, that one side just gives up?
Many wars have different endings. We tend to say that what happened in 1914, 1918 was the First World War. The truth is that you can say the first global conflict was possibly the 7 Years' War. Yes. And then the Napoleonic Wars, also a very global conflict. So this is even this aspect of the reality of warfare is nothing new, or at least a very way older thing that we tend to think about it. And the recent wars, the wars of 20th century, also changed as compared to what we experienced in the 19th century, where it was quite easy to say that that capturing the capital of your enemy means the end of the war. Right now, this is a lot of exhaustion that is included in what means the end of war. A war of attrition is what defines the current warfare. But also, in a way, a fact that with the nuclear arms as a part of the conflict, at least like in terms of the escalation ladder that is possible between the warring parties, there is no easy way to define what the war would mean, because at some point it becomes impossible for the warring parties even to use the full potential of their arms.
So does that mean that there needs to be a joint understanding of what the war is about, rather than in order to work a way out of these things?
I would go even to the different direction. So, in my opinion, the 20th century defined the end of the war as ending of strategically offensive capabilities of at least one of the warring parties. If both warring parties lack this strategically offensive potential, usually the war ends in a kind of a ceasefire, frozen conflict. If at least one of the warring parties lacks this potential, then this is the warring party that actually that loses the war. But then you also have the political aspects, the societal aspects in all of that. When you look at the Korean Peninsula War, it was also the fact that the global players got involved, and at some point the escalation was rising very, very high. So that's why the ceasefire happened. And even if you look at the 19th century, as I said, this concept of actually capturing the capital, it was pretty much the mistake of Napoleon in 1912, when he thought that in a very Western European way, that if he invades Russia, if he captures Moscow, that would end the war. And it didn't end the war because Russians were thinking differently. They still have, and they used to have even back then, like a very Asian, I would say, cultural, strategically cultural aspect in the way how they conduct foreign policy, how they conduct the warfare, which meant that you cannot even conduct the war after your capital falls, because it's all about the survival of the one who's in power.
That the will to continue fighting.
Yes.
Which brings us neatly on to today's Russo-Ukrainian war. But first of all, we'll have a look at the second clip.
If the peace negotiations, or rather the attempts at them, point to anything, is that the war in Ukraine will most likely not be cleanly resolved. Wars rarely end with all sides being satisfied, nor do they often end with the total capitulation of one of the sides, as was the case in the World Wars. Currently, those involved in the negotiations seem to be aiming for at least some sort of ceasefire. In of itself, of course, this means it isn't permanent. It would, however, be a step in the right direction. The reason why this war will most likely not be resolved is because neither side has gotten what it wanted. Ukraine hasn't pushed the Russians out, and Russia hasn't either conquered or anointed the Ukrainian state. What's more, the full-scale invasion itself is but a further step in a conflict that has been ongoing since 2014. If you listen to the following words of then British Prime Minister David Cameron, you'd think he was saying them about the situation in 2025.
Since Russia destabilized Ukraine and illegally annexed Crimea, NATO's response has focused on reassuring our eastern allies and deterring Russian aggression elsewhere.
The war in Ukraine is not the longest lasting conflict that is currently around, far from it, even with its more than 10 years of history. Another modern war which seems to have no end is the one surrounding Israel and Palestine. It is even difficult to call this a war, since it's more of a series of repeating conflicts that have not been resolved for several decades. Each time progress seems to be made towards some semblance of peace, the situation backslides. Both parties make it clear that they are always prepared to renew hostilities.
We are prepared to resume intense fighting at any moment. Our operational plans are ready.
The most recent chapter of this conflict is the war in Gaza, which started in the wake of Hamas's attack on Israel in October 2023. Despite multiple attempts at a ceasefire and concerns about it spilling over into the wider Middle East, it is all but certain to be yet another war between Israel and the Palestinians, which will not be formally resolved.
There's been several years ago, 2022, there was a report written by the Hague Centre for Strategic Studies about the Russo-Ukrainian war, and it identified 2 points. So I'd like to talk about those. First of all, there's a culmination point when there is Kulminationspunkt, Clausewitz again. We can't get away from him. Still a precondition that necessitates the war being brought to a close. And the second point was the question of ripeness, and here was something that was labelled the MHS, the mutually hurting stalemate. In your opinion, as a thinker about war and conflict, has this point been reached, or are we, as you said, the Russians have a totally different philosophy about war?
I would even add the third concept, which is very based in the theory of negotiations, which is called BATNA, the best alternative to negotiated agreement, as long as there is an alternative and it is perceived by one of the parties as better option than actually ending the conflict, they will take this opportunity and will continue. At this point, on the Ukrainian side, Zelensky, I wouldn't say that possibly all of the Ukrainians, but certainly Zelensky's administration perceives as a better option to continue the fight than to take the agreement that was put on the table by President Trump. So this is like one perception on the end of the war in Ukraine. The second aspect, which you mentioned about Clausewitz and these issues, I'm certain that there is a difference in perception between Russians and between the Western world as to the end of this conflict. The Russians, they think in generations, as compared to us, where we have like the electoral cycles. For the societies of the Western world, this war has continued for enough of the time as to be felt as also the element of inflation that impacts negatively the economic situation in the Western world, and is even our focus on what is happening in Ukraine is fading. Maybe not in Poland, but the western you go, the more it is visible. In this way of thinking, for Vladimir Putin, there will be enough to even settle on certain terms, because he can actually picture that in his own propaganda as a success in this war. He was capable of gaining territories. More importantly, he would probably also have an option to impact through negotiations, not through the war itself. Limitation. He would put a limitation on Ukraine's sovereignty, especially when it comes to the future membership in NATO, for example. He may even get the recognition of Crimea by the global powers such as the US. He was even allowed to become a part of the global powers because he's considered to be one by, for example, Donald Trump. So he can tick a lot of boxes and say that this was a success for him to even start this war. But what is more important, in my opinion, it is that he can actually wait and see what will be the result of this war for Ukrainians once the actions in the front line cease, but not necessarily the conflict cease to exist, because there will be a lot of political turmoil right after the war ends.
So can President Putin tailor his war aims to cut his cloth according to his situation? Initially, when he first reinvaded the Ukraine, it was that, yes, he was going to roll into Kiev and take over the whole city, and then the country. And now he's steadily but very slowly making progress in the east. So does he have to say, well, that's what I always thought of our war aims, but because it falls short of taking over Kiev and going in a big parade from May the 9th? For now,
we like the parallels to history, and in my opinion, the best parallel to history in that aspect would be the partitions of Poland. We have seen the first partition of Ukraine in 2014. What we can see right now, those are the attempts to the second partition that would be even recognized by global powers. And what can happen in future is what happened to Poland with the third partition. And if I may remind you, it took wars to conduct two partitions, but it was without the war that the third partition happened. It was so. In my opinion, this is like extremely important when we think about the war in Ukraine, not to focus on territory, but rather focus on sovereignty of Ukraine, which is the most important thing that has to be preserved. If Ukraine will continue to be sovereign nation, it will continue to be a sovereign country. If it will go through the process of reforms, economic reforms, it will be closer to the common market of the European Union, etc., etc. This gives Ukraine a perspective, and the perspective means as well. It means also the process of changing institutions, of adapting to the Western institutions, etc., etc. If that will be a success story for Ukraine, then Ukraine will preserve its sovereignty. It will preserve its statehood for years to come. And from that perspective, the aspect of the territorial integrity is less important. I know how hard it might be to find this way of thinking, and how hard it is to stick to this way of thinking. But this is what I take from the history of Poland.
But how do you define sovereignty? I mean, Poland couldn't secure its own borders in the 18th century. In the 21st century, Ukraine is on a life drip feed of supply from initially the United States, but now Europe. Does that make a mockery of the idea of being a sovereign nation?
What Poland lacked in...
And we have to just recognise that, Ukraine isn't a sovereign state anymore. But act accordingly.
What Poland lacked in the 18th century was certainly two things: the well-functioning armed forces, capable of conducting warfare, and the functioning state, functioning institutions of the state. In my opinion, Ukraine still has the possibility to preserve both, even if the ceasefire is reached under these conditions that were proposed by Trump. Even under these conditions, this is possible for Ukraine to preserve these aspects of sovereignty. And I wouldn't say that Ukraine is not sovereign right now. I mean, look at what Zelensky is capable of doing during the negotiations even with Trump. So that gives the glimpse into how much Ukraine is, of course, also self-reliant, capable of deciding. So the important aspect in all of that is the sovereignty of Ukraine, and if that will be reached, if that will be the result of this war, then I would say that Vladimir Putin hasn't won yet. He may have won the second episode, but he hasn't won yet.
That's right. Just ceasefires and peace treaties are generally started by, or wars are finished by signature on a piece of paper, but according to this report, more than three-quarters of these break down within 2 years, 12% last for 2 to 5 years, and 12% lasted for more than 5 years. Is that something that we need to just bear in mind, that some form of stability is better than war? Any kind of national stability is better than a bad deal is better than fighting it out?
Well, still, war is one of the options in all of these answers. So, what I will take out of this study, and what I will take out of the times we're living through right now, it is that we have to, as also the Western world, come back to the thinking about the warfare as one of the options. As hard as it gets, we have to be prepared for that, and the ideas of everlasting peace and end of history. This was a mistake even to think that way.
Yes, as one of our previous guests said, there are no holidays from history.
Not at all.
Bartłomiej Kot, thank you very, very much for coming to the programme. That's all we have time for today. Join us next time, as usual, Tuesdays, 21:35, so that's 35 minutes past 9 CET, so do join us then.